Hi, I'm Cindy Siegel. I'm chairman of the Harris County Republican Party. And today this is the podcast, Leaders on the Right, and we're excited to have Holly Hansen from the Texan. This is an exciting segment because usually you're interviewing me versus the opposite, or I see you interviewing people. And, I think a lot of people today, everything's so media driven and social media driven. I joke about sometimes I feel like what goes on the news is more like Entertainment Tonight. So, why don't you tell us how you got into being a journalist?
Sure. Well, the funny thing is, I never set out to be a journalist. I say never. And sometimes I even joke that I'm kind of an accidental journalist. I studied history. I studied actually medieval history and Russian Soviet history and went to graduate school and had hoped to be a history professor at some point. But, life has its way of putting us on different pathways. And I was an activist at one point and am very involved with the Republican Party. And I did write some op-eds and things like that. But I got a little bit frustrated with the opinion writing. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a place for that. I think there's some wonderful op-ed writers out there. But I started to feel like I was just preaching to the choir. And I also saw a kind of a void in good media coverage. I got frustrated when I would go to an event and then read another reporter's account of the event and think to myself, wait a minute, that's not how that happened, or there's this other context that you left out. The other frustration that I had was seeing media not cover things that I thought were newsworthy, that were interesting to me. I also like a lot of facts and data. And so when I see a news report that seems very infused with opinion and seems infused with, really loaded language, it frustrates me. So I started thinking about, what it would be like to be a journalist and to write these things the way I would like to read them. So in 2019, former state senator Connie Burton called me and said, hey, I think I'm going to start a media company. What do you think? That's a great idea. And so, Connie Burton stepped up and she and her husband founded the Texan News, which is a digital media outlet. So we unfortunately don't have a print newspaper, which I'm old school and I love print newspapers. I love getting, the Wall Street Journal and reading it through the entire thing, especially on the weekends when you have a little more time. But the Texan News is kind of, with the modern times and people are getting their news media from the internet for the most part, I think. So that's what we do, but we're a little bit different because we don't accept advertising dollars. We don't accept sponsorships. We're completely subscriber funded. So there are no outside entities influencing what we write with financial donations. So we get a lot of questions about that. We don't run editorials. Occasionally, Connie Burton will send out what she calls her hot take, but it has more to do with media and our criticisms of the way the mainstream media covers a lot of issues. We don't endorse candidates either, so we get a lot of questions about that. And what we feel is that when you're endorsing candidates, it can interfere with your more objective coverage of the issues. So we'd like to be able to write about primary races without it appearing that we're taking a side in the primary race, for example. So we launched in 2019, and I have to say it's been a lot of fun. We've learned a lot, and we've grown quite a bit. We're adding new subscribers all the time, and we're having a little fun shaking up the media scene in the state of Texas. We are very careful with the language that we use. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about why that's different, but I'll give you some examples.
Sure.
You see a lot in the coverage nowadays. You see people using the term gender affirming care, or you see reproductive health care. Our opinion is that those are loaded terms. That's a form of editorializing the content. People know what abortion is. And I don't know if they've decided that abortion has too many negative connotations, so they're going to use this language like reproductive health care. But I think it's okay to talk about it's an abortion, right? We all know what that means.
Yeah.
And so we stick to those terms that we know everyone understands, and we don't try to clothe these issues with these other terms. In the case of gender affirming care, I mean, come on, we know that those are medical procedures that are changing the sex of an individual. And we're going to continue to describe those procedures as sex transitioning procedures and things along those lines. So even in the words that you use to describe issues, I think there's a danger of infusing opinionated and editorial content, and that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to present content that will not alienate someone who is not necessarily a Republican or a conservative or libertarian. And we would like for someone in any part of the political spectrum to be able to read it and gain some information, right? Gain some good solid facts about an issue, about a policy, what it might do, what it might not do, what's actually happening, in the state legislature and so forth.
People today, I mean, because they do get a lot of their news internet. And actually, I heard a year or two ago, I think John Solomon, he was, and he had been a newscaster and all that, and he had talked and he said he thought that all the big TV stations or news outlets would go away, that it would come to a point where everything is done via the internet. Do you think that? Do you see? I mean, because you all have grown, like you said, and it's strictly digital.
Absolutely. And, I have a lot of friends in media and some of the more traditional outlets. And for example, our local Fox affiliate here, they have an online portion of their news coverage that a lot of people are going to instead of watching the actual broadcast. I confess, I don't have a television service at my house. I get all of my news from the internet, and if I want to watch a news segment that I heard about, and I have a lot of friends again who do this, I go on the internet, pull up their website, and watch it that way. So that could very well be. I think some of the older population still watches the broadcast media, but most people now are shifting, and especially younger people. They don't have cable.
Well, and that's my, I have two millennial daughters, and they don't have cable. They do it everything streaming and via the internet. They get their internet service, and that's it.
It's changing, and you have to adapt to that. But of course, with that, there's a danger, right? Because there are so many outlets now that you can turn to online, and it's hard to know. I think initially when you're looking at a new outlet, we've seen a number of new outlets pop up in this area and across the nation. It's hard to know how reliable they're going to be until you've looked at some of their content. And I think that the other danger is that if you're always going on the internet and you're looking at the same sources all the time, you might miss some information. I'm a big fan of going to Real Clear Politics because they do have that. Yes, they do have those, sort of contrasting pieces that they'll, put one right after the other, and one will be a kind of more conservative voice, and then the next one will be a more progressive voice. And I actually like to read those because I like to know what the argument is coming from the other side of the aisle. And I think it's unfortunate that we've gotten to this place where we can't actually stop and consider the argument of someone who disagrees with us, right? We get, we kind of throw up these walls. I do like to consider it. I'm not afraid to look at the argument of an opponent and think about it. And, it forces me to evaluate my own positions, and it often reinforces those.
So your news outlet, the Texan, I mean, I really do, and I'm not just saying that because you're on our podcast, but I really do think that you're fair and objective. And, I know when I was an elected official, I just, you know, I mean, you always would rather that they say something nice about you, but that doesn't always happen. But I felt like if they were at least trying to be fair, and even, if I sounded stupid and I did something stupid, that's on me. But the problem is, and this is where I think a lot of people are today, they don't know who to believe, you know, and it seems like journalism, the field has moved away from really being a fair and objective and presenting sort of the facts, both sides of it, where you'll read an article, the local chronicle. I mean, and it's not the editorial, it will be just an article, and you can see that they're inserting their opinion. And how do you, as a journalist, I think the Texan really does try to be fair and objective, but how do you keep your own personal feelings out of a story?
That's a good question. For one thing, I would encourage anyone who's involved in media or politics to remember that the person that you're covering, in your case, you're the chair of the party. If I'm writing something about the chair of the Democrat Party or the Republican Party, try to remember that's a human being. There's no need to be vicious with them. I'm more interested in policy, but I just try to think of, how can I fairly portray, for example, a conversation in commissioner's court, which I cover a lot. How can I fairly quote not just the person I agree with, but the person I disagree with? And so I do make an effort to say, okay, well, I don't say okay, well, but I try to write very professionally, but I will include the argument that the Republican Commissioner Tom Ramsey made, and also the argument that the Democrat Commissioner Adrian Garcia made on a particular issue. Because I feel like the reader can take both of those opinions, both of those arguments, those approaches to policy, and decide for themselves what they like. And I do try to reproduce as faithfully as possible what that argument might be. I don't always agree with it, and I fear sometimes that you can tell what my opinion is by the background content that I inject. But I think it's relevant to whatever issue is there. So, if there's a consultant firm that the county has hired and we're going to spend several million dollars on whatever they're going to do, I go and look at this consulting firm. Who's on the board? What are their beliefs? What have they written elsewhere? And how do I think that might play into what they're going to do for the county? I think that's relevant background information. But I do try to, show what the other side is saying. And you just have to remember that for the most part, I'd say by and large, a lot of people have the best of intentions when they're crafting policy. You might hate their policy. You might think it's terrible, but they really do think that that's a good idea, right? And they're not necessarily evil. There might be exceptions.
Yeah. Well, so if I'm a reader or just, the average voter out there, and we're so overwhelmed with what is out there, and I've joked and I've said sometimes, I mean, I could put something out and post it on Facebook or Twitter and all this, and it could be totally a lie, and it gets a life of its own, and it becomes a fact. And we've talked about a staff that you'll see that there'll be that some paper or news outlet gets its facts wrong, but and it blows up, and then unfortunately the correction is like at the very back, or it's a teeny tiny 3 weeks later that they say, well, oops. But by then, what was not true becomes in itself true in people's minds. So if I'm the reader, how do I know who to believe in? And I mean, what would your advice be to someone that's just really wants to learn more and they want to figure out, sure, what is really true? Because you're right, you listen to different stories and different news outlets, and they you can see it with the TV, the same story gets twisted totally two different ways.
Right. Well, I think, for me personally, I also consume news. So, I read a lot of different news stories about things that I don't write about necessarily. And I always come to a story with a little dose of skepticism, right? And I'm one who really parses the words that are used, and I can spot some editorialized words that are used to describe an event. But I really think you have to be skeptical. It is overwhelming. There are so many outlets. There are so many news stories, and we're in a place in history where we're getting bombarded all of the time. But I do think you have to be cautious about, if you read something in the Chronicle, uh, maybe check another source to see, what someone else has said, kind of like that Real Clear Politics setup. If you read something in the Texas Tribune, you can always check out the Texan News to see what we're having to say about it, because we may have a slightly different way of conveying that information. But I do think a healthy dose of skepticism is important when you're consuming news. If something just really, bites into your preconceived notions, you're like, yes, that proves my case. Maybe if it's too good to be true, it may be too good to be true. So you should probably just kind of double check there.
Do you think the changes in your profession, are they good or are they not?
Well,
Because there's always the question about social media.
right.
I think, social media, and quite frankly, if I weren't the chair of the party, I probably would only be using Facebook for checking up on high school friends, and what they're doing, or bragging about my kids. So I think it's great. It's allowed, it gives me, as just average person out there, the opportunity to, I have a friend who lives in New Zealand, and it's a great way for me to see her daughter and her grandchildren. But then the other side of it is not always the most positive. So,
That's true.
and your field has changed so much from the days of putting out a newspaper or.
And news happens so quickly now. The internet is wonderful, and I know a lot of people hate it. I love Twitter. I think it's a great source of news, especially when the Texas legislature is in session. You can follow the feed for the legislature and find out what's happening on the floor at that moment, right? So who's saying what kind of bill just got passed or is being debated. I love that. When you have freedom of speech and you have freedom of the press, you are going to always have that downside of, there being bad information out there. You do draw some negative attention when you cover certain issues. I recently wrote a story about a group that wants to end the sex offenders registry list. They had a conference here in Houston, and after I wrote that article and which I tried to be very fair. I tried to present their argument and how they thought this was unconstitutional, but I also kind of took issue with some of the data they presented. I looked at one of the stories and showed an expansion of the data that didn't quite fit their narrative. And after that, it was pretty well inundated with emails and phone calls and people who were very angry with me about that. But you have to have thick skin. You have to write something and stand by it. But along with that, you also have to be gracious when you have made a mistake. You have to admit the mistake and correct it. And I just think that's very ethical. We try to be very transparent at the Texan. When we've made a mistake, we have a corrections page. And you can go down the corrections page and see everywhere we've, had to go back and correct something.
So it's not on the very last page in
Well, it is at the bottom of every article, but if you want to, go and see the corrections. We do want to get the story right, but inevitably, as a journalist, you're going to get something wrong at some point. I mean, the thing is, you don't know what you don't know. So, you just don't understand. I worked on an article today that was very complicated, and I had to call back one of my sources probably 6 or 7 times to say, "Now wait a minute, what did this mean?" So it's going to happen. You're trying to manage a lot of information. I love that aspect of it, learning about new topics. I've learned about things I never even thought about prior to being a journalist. But yeah, negative attention is just part of it. You just have to be thick.
So what is the story or something that you did that you felt like, I really moved the needle here? That I wrote something and I really had an impact.
Well, I think for me, I wrote a story in August of 2021, and I had been watching Harris County Commissioner's Court and these very long meetings and a lot going on. But there was one little contract that caught my attention, and I didn't really understand the extent of the problem with this contract. But I wrote a story because I noticed that the county had awarded this $11 million contract to this contractor, this woman who had worked for Commissioner Adrian Garcia, worked for Hillary Clinton, and worked for the Democrat National Committee. And I thought, wow, that's really kind of weird that she gets this contract. So I wrote a story about it. I was the first journalist to write about that, and long story short, other journalists also got involved, and we learned a lot more over time, and it did end up prompting a criminal investigation from the Harris County District Attorney's Office that resulted in the indictment of 3 county staffers.
I want to thank you all for joining us today. It's been great talking to Holly Hansen and learning more about how you can actually vet the media and know what is true and what's not true. I hope you'll join us next week when we have Commissioner Tom Ramsey with the Harris County Commissioner's Court joining us and talking to us about upcoming propositions on the ballot, as well as the budget and what's going on down in Commissioner's Court. Thanks and have a great day.